saying thank you all for being here this whole day. It has been a very fast-moving discussion, and I would say very informative. And my task is as was suggested, okay, put everything together in a nice, neat package, put a bow on it, and what have we done? Well, it's also to maybe raise questions about what could be done going forward. And I start by looking really at the title of our structure here, our title of our conference, Russia, China, Architects of a New Global Order. This is actually an interesting question because, of course, if we go back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, architects of a new global order, of course, we're talking about a Cold War. And then when we look at interest strategies, prospects for conflicts, and prospects for cooperation, it looks very, very different. Whether we have fighting over islands, in the Far East, Russia, the Soviet Union, and China, this wonderful triangle of power competition, the U.S., the USSR, and China, we would analyze these very much in a realist Cold War fashion. And I think many of us in the room remember that. We either did it ourselves or we were students of those who focused on that, and no one ever thought the situation would change. Right? Just to put it right out there, there was a feeling that the Cold War was going to continue for some time. Post facto, there are people who said, oh yeah, I predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. No question. If you look at my reading, I mean, I never really wrote about it, but if you look at what I implied, this is exactly what I said. Well, no. I mean, it caught us by surprise because these are these wonderful moments in history that do make us rethink and reanalyze. And I sort of look at my own personal experience. When I look at our topic today, I think of my first trip to the region, which was a trip to the Soviet Union at the height of the evil empire period, going to Komsomol meetings and getting yelled at for being an American imperialist, to my most recent one, which was last week, to China, where I was taken to a room meeting with Chinese academics and getting yelled at for being an American imperialist. The context of both of these actually was quite different. The first was this us versus them, Rocky III environment, or was it IV, I'm not sure, where we thought of each other as mortal enemies. We gamed each other out. We were economically decoupled. We could blow the hell out of each other. Still thinking of it in terms of a purposeful attack. But this evolution is taking place, and even when we looked at Siberia and the Far East and mixing them together sometimes, right, we sort of confused them. The notion at best was, well, China will take it over. Russia can't do anything, and then Chinese will cross the borders. Russian social scientists would discuss this, and Americans would chime in. So again, why do we discuss these historic moments when looking at today? Because we do see that how we analyze this region today, how we analyze Russia, China, people that brought in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and of course the United States, We brought in Southeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula. That was a hot topic not too long ago, or about an hour and a half ago. We bring in all of these issues, and it's important that we need to understand both our perceptions of then and how we've taken some of this Cold War baggage and how we've taken these perceptions of the region from another world and how they shape the ways in which we analyze it today and how we're looking at whether it's Russian intentions, Chinese intentions, American intentions, North Korean intentions, Kazakh intentions, Ossetian intentions. Do Mackinder and Brzezinski live long today? Well, there are some who look at this. Geopolitics is important. The phrase great game can still be Google searched, and we can look at this particular region. We have all sorts of approaches that we can look at. But here's the pause moment. In the words of the great philosopher or elvish queen Galadriel in the Fellowship of the Rings, the world has changed. Quote, the Lord of the Rings. And I think our speakers have all demonstrated this. If you look from the very beginning, from the first panel, we have demonstrated indeed that the world has changed. The sorts of issues we discussed today, and especially for the students who come in here, and maybe they're listening like, wow, this is really curious. For the old timers, I think for some of it's like, wow, it really is interesting because these conversations, these specific topics and subtopics and data points would not have been available years back. It is really making us re-examine the roles of these countries. And even the notion of can Russia and China be architects of a new global order? Sure, but now, of course, is it a multipolar, non-polar, whatever polar world are we looking at? Are there non-state actors that are now influential and instrumental in the world? Russia and China can be important, but I think they're not going to be the driving forces, nor is the U.S., in terms of regional politics. So how can they do this? What sort of strategies could they employ? Our first panel suggested, of course, a number of approaches focusing largely on regional organizations. I'll take a page out of my own sort of obscure past, which in the mid-90s I was asked by a British publication that was looking at global security organizations. They were doing an encyclopedia of security organizations. And they asked me, they said, well, you're working on Central Asia. Would you be willing to write the chapter on the Shanghai Five, later become the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Yeah, sure, I'll do this. And it was going to be this massive, 500-page volume. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm going to write a lot. They said, we'll give you 500 words for the SCO. And I always know where the article is, or the chapter contribution is, because it's the very last one. That's the importance we put on the Shanghai Forum, or Shanghai Five, that it was insignificant. It's really not important to the U.S. or to the Europeans. This was a British publication. Today, of course, a much different situation. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is being discussed and is being analyzed, I think, in a more serious approach. What I would suggest, though, is when we look at these organizations, before we think that they're going to run amok, take over the world, or become the dominant actors, let's wait to see how they deal with existential crises. Let's wait and see how they deal with challenges within their boundaries, within their membership. NATO has been around for a long time. It still gets beaten up in the press by analysts and pundits, and its obituary gets written about once a decade. Whether it was anything from the Vietnam War, I think that was a good one. The Suez Crisis, that was a good one. Putting Pershing II missiles in Europe in the 80s. The end of the Cold War, the Iraq War. There's all been these moments in time where people have written the obituary of NATO, and yet somehow it seems to move on. It changes its mission, it morphs, it adjusts, it adapts. Can the same be said for the Eurasian Union? Can the same be said for the SCO? We have to wait and see. These are still young organizations. They're still finding themselves in terms of what their focus is to be. And so I would simply say, as we look at these as structures, something to think in the future, let's see what they eventually become and what this means for Russia, China, and the other member states. When we drill down into specific issues, as we did in the second panel, one, I just have to throw this out. Chicken ribs and cold tea. I wrote that down. I love that, and at least it will give blank stares when I utter it in conferences or in meetings or in like faculty meetings. You people are all giving me chicken ribs and cold tea. I think that's a good. But the reality is, of course, it's more than that, right? I mean, we're looking at how that is Russia and China, how are they looking at each other on specific issues, on North Korea? How are they dealing with this frenemy? Or this, I like the analogy of the jackhammer that's sort of out of control, right? That you can't really control it anymore. Can there be strategic partnerships in the region? Sino-Russian strategic partnerships. This is raised a lot, in the West. Again, the last month's, happy historic group hug between the Russian and Chinese leaderships caused some, flurry of activity of, is this a reconnection of these states? And I think we've heard some cogent reasons why that could be the case. Does this really mean something for the U.S. or not? Should we be afraid of it, or should we simply follow it and analyze it and just passionately understand what it may mean for our security? These are questions that I think we have to figure out. However, I will say, coming from Washington, the cold warriors who are still running the country, this puts fear in their heart. When they see Russia and China getting together, they're still thinking in terms of Mao Zedong and Brezhnev or something, getting together, or even Mao and Stalin, or pre-Mao. But these are the sorts of issues that I think are critical that the second panel addressed, and I would add actually the discussion on cybersecurity, which is only becoming a more and more important concern. Just today, in fact, part of this trip that I took to China last week was getting Chinese think tanks involved in a security studies network that we manage, and I got a response from an OST colleague that said, "You've got to be kidding. If the Chinese get involved in your network, that's yet another way they can attack our cyber system, because you send out email messages, right?" So, I mean, they've attacked us already at NDU, so I don't think there's anything happen. But that cybersecurity is really in the front lobe of us is important, and the way that this was analyzed, in all seriousness, of how Russians and how the Chinese view these questions, I think, is critical as we get into this new sphere of either cooperation or perhaps competition, which I think is going to become more the case. Jeff's, sort of the first of the two discussions, we bring up the notion of this broader relationship between the two, the economic ties, and really the question of economic development. This comes to the heart of a lot of what we were saying today. The neo-colonial economic relationship is without question. I'm not sure if they can get an answer to that. My sense from the Chinese side is they're fully confident in their development plan. At least they publicly stated this, whether personally they're still nervous about things. But the dynamic or relationship between the two is going to be one of senior partner, junior partner. And like it or not, the Russians are going to have to deal with the junior partner in this relationship. Now, other major colonial powers have adjusted. Let's talk to our friends in Great Britain. They've gone from being the global master to a junior partner in a transatlantic relationship. It took several generations for people to accept that, but it has been accepted, and in fact, it's a role that can be exploited well. Can Russia understand this transition and adjust and deftly manage its policies as a junior partner to China, if in fact this is what's going to happen? Let's wait and see. I still think this generation in Russia cannot do that. This generation in Russia still sees itself as a major player. There are two strategies, and most importantly, this relation to the U.S. pivot to Asia, which I have to make, these are my views. in vogue is really problematic. I take issue with our folks who are still in the 19th century. I think we can give them some guidance to think in terms of 21st century diplomacy. But it is this reaction to our policies and actions that's critical. We, as Americans, need to think in terms of how our government is presenting itself on these issues. And clearly, when it comes to re-engaging in Asia, re-engaging in sort of the Russia-China world, have to understand the potential backlashes. And this is without question when we look at areas of common concern, Syria, Iran, North Korea. What was not discussed, interestingly, Afghanistan is key. Our changing mission, I'll phrase it that way. Is it a withdrawal? Well, let's see if the status of forces agreement is signed or not. If it is not, it will be a complete withdrawal. If it is signed, there will be a modest presence. I'll give us one of two options. But in either case, it's going to have a fundamental effect on Chinese perceptions of South Asian security and Russian perceptions of South Asian security. And they're not the same. China sees it as a land of opportunity with some security threats that need to be managed by others. Russia sees it as a source of all evil, as a source of extremist threats and a source, quite frankly, of cross-border drug trafficking, which is fundamentally affecting Russian society. And so these sorts of challenges, I'm taking us afield from sort of the basic Russia-China dyad, but it's going to have an impact on these, on these countries. And so as I look forward, these are some issues that I think we need to consider. And then, we've had an excellent panel to end the day, and so I don't want to reiterate what's been said, but the economic development in Siberia, again, I highlighted earlier, 20 years ago, we would have looked at this, boom, let's have all the Chinese come into Russia, and, Helen kind of reminded us that it's a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced in terms of development. But as I think has been hinted all along, and this ties in with Jeff's keynote presentation, is are we looking at Siberia and Russia as really a raw material or resource provider to China, and that's it? Or can there be more commercial activity, equal trade? And this is the challenge both of them have to figure out. The impact of global warming, that will be the curious one, but that'll be another generation, probably another conference with different people. And even when we think in terms of how they view specific events, and this ties in everything about FCO, CSTO, which maybe hasn't been highlighted, the bilateral ties, and that's what Chuck Bartles was talking about with respect to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Just as a modest anecdote, I was in Dushanbe during the war, and during that conflict, I was in a hotel, a small hotel that had a number of Chinese guests because this was the advance party for the SCO summit. The Chinese delegation was there. They were grousing, of course, that they couldn't be in Beijing during the Olympics, but we all could watch it on the bad TV in the room, in the hotel lobby. Well, what happened in Ossetia, the polite way to say it was annoyed them to no end. They were angry. They were visibly shaking and angry at what was happening. These were mid-level, lower-level bureaucrats in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs who were busy setting up an SCO, helping the Tajiks get ready for the SCO summit. And here is this Russian-Georgian conflict spoiling the pristine serenity of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. That offended them. The second part was something Chuck noted quite well, which is it challenged the notion of national integrity and sovereignty. This is a hallmark of China's policy, regionally, globally. They're a great partner for many countries in Central Asia, in Africa, Venezuela, you name it, because what happens in your country stays in your country. It's the Vegas rule of foreign affairs. And the Chinese take that to heart because they don't want to be criticized for what goes on in their house. And so when you see this conflict across the border, however it was cast, and I will say on our TV, at least, as watching just the Tajik coverage, I just assumed that this was the good Russian military saving the lives of Ossetians who were being slaughtered by Georgians. Little did I know when I came back to the U.S., oh, there's a different narrative. That's an interesting one. And then eventually you read enough and you start to understand what it it is. But this reality check between Russia and China was very real. That was 2008. That was maybe the first interesting test of the SCO. But let's see if they have other ones, because I do think that these states are going to have some future challenges. So what can we take away from all this? What does all of this mean? And good. I didn't think I was going to take 30 minutes, and I'm not. First of all, we need to change how we view Russia and China. We need to re-examine what data points are important to us. When we examined these states through our Cold War lenses, we looked at them as great powers in a zero-sum competition. Even if they are in a modest zero-sum competition today over specific things, we have to understand that motivations for each of the states are different. China's motivation, quite frankly, is satisfying its own people. Let's throw that one out there. They're not hungry for energy and resources around the world just because it's a great game. This is not, monopoly. They're doing it because they have an expectations gap that they need to close in their own country. Russia is looking at relevance, which I still think is a challenge, but also wanting to matter in certain areas. Why they're engaged in Syria, why they're engaged in some of the neighboring, why they want peaceful capacity, as they said. But we need to relook how these states view each other, how they view us, how they view sort of the regional surroundings, to give us a better, clearer understanding of this kind of dynamic. And of course, I think we've got a lot of that today. Secondly, and this is a wonderful thing, the data is available. Can you imagine doing research on this again 20 years ago? We would have had a lot of, I think these are, we would get GNP numbers, right? And then that's about it. Now we're looking at real data, access to information, access to presentations, to studies and surveys, scholars and policymakers from both countries and the neighboring states who share their ideas with us. We have folks who understand the languages in question, not just Russian and Chinese, and increasingly both. I remember the first time I met somebody who knew both Russian and Chinese, and he was a history professor of mine more than 30 years ago, who, everyone was like, wow, this guy's amazing. He knows both Russian and Chinese. A lot of people now, not a lot, but it's a growing community because people understand that when you're looking at cross-border issues, this isn't a freak study, it's a real study. It's an important study. And now we're looking not just at those, but Kazakh, Uzbek, Uyghur, and other languages. So this is critical. Thirdly, it was hinted at today, and it kind of got tampered down and then brought up again, but theory matters. People talked about theory, I like that. And yes, in the same room, we had instrumentalists and constructivists living together, cooperating. Even a few neo-realists, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I know who you are. We all got along, and maybe you snickered about the other one when they said something, but you were polite. And that's important because I think to better understand or tease out some of the nuances in this kind of study, we need to approach it with different theories, especially for those of us who are atheoretical. I think this is important. And lastly, and most importantly, and this is a plea, if there are any folks who work with federal funding, area studies matter. It does matter. Not just we need to keep this alive and keep it funded and have people study foreign language and study in foreign countries, which is really a legacy here at the University of Kansas. I mean, it really brings it home that this is one of these old centers of area studies. But the sort of discussion we had today shows again and again and again why understanding different countries from the ground up. Not just looking at it from a desk in Washington and saying, I read a cable that says President Putin did this. It really is a matter of understanding why. Why did he say it? What was the audience? What was he looking at? What verb did he use? Did you translate it right? And these are critical issues, right? Recess. These can be critical problems. And so if we truly can understand areas and keep learning, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I've been at this for, I should say, a few years, and I'm considering myself a good student. And and I hope someday to even get better. And I think that sort of ambition or desire has been exhibited here by not just our speakers, but also the audience here. So, just to conclude, this has been, I will say, a very dense conference, and that's a good thing. Many topics, many ideas, captured in, I think, a very structured format that has helped tremendously. I mean, I appreciate, by the way, those especially our panel chairs who kept us all in line. I mean, getting academics in a room and having them spend the day together, we could easily be on the first panel right now and say, well, we'll get to the lunch is a little cold right now. You know, we've actually moved on time, and this has been good, and we've kept it going. If there are speakers, more questions, by the way, for our speakers, you can sit with them at dinner tonight or grab them right after, because most of them are still here in the room. So if you want to continue the conversation and obviously do this electronically, you know, and I'd be curious to know, you know, are there issues maybe we haven't addressed today? We talked about a lot, but there may still be that one or two gems out there that you say, should have done that. Well, these are things we can bring up, and in your evaluations, maybe put this up, because it could help us as we look to the future. You know, what are possible topics or ideas that could be raised in future conferences, future conversations. And so with that, all I have to say is I look forward to 2014 and see what comes of that. We're going to have a big transition year. We have elections in lots of countries. I'm sure there's going to be one or two agreements and maybe even some military exercises off the Korean Peninsula. We'll see how these work, and hopefully they're just exercises. But with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to turn it back to our hosts from PHMSA.